The toast was burnt. Again, Poppy Higgins stared at the two blackened squares of bread with a tilt of her head, her nose wrinkling just a little bit. Most people would have sighed or perhaps even muttered a naughty word, but Poppy simply reached for the butter knife. She scraped the charred bits into the sink with a rhythmic scritch, 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 humming a tune she'd heard on the wireless that morning. It wasn't a tragedy, it was just a bit more crunch. A bit of charcoal was supposed to be good for the digestion, wasn't it? Or was that for dogs? Either way, it's a lovely day for a crunch, she whispered to her reflection in the kettle. The kettle whistled back, a cheery, high-pitched scream that echoed through her tiny flat in Richmond. Poppy loved her flat. It was the size of a postage stamp, and the floorboards groaned like an old man with a hip problem, but it was hers. She'd filled it with potted geraniums that she occasionally forgot to water and dozens of colourful cushions that didn't match at all. She checked her watch. Ooh, crumbs, late. I'm late for the lion. The lion was Alistair Sterling. He didn't actually have a mane or a tail, but he had a roar that could make a grown man's knees turn to jelly. He was the chief executive of Sterling Global, and Poppy was his personal assistant. Well, she was his temporary personal assistant, filling in for a woman named Mrs. Gable who had gone on a 3-month cruise to find herself. Poppy suspected Mrs. Gable was actually hiding from Mr. Sterling's temper. Poppy grabbed her yellow raincoat because the London sky looked like a bruised plum and dashed out the door. She tripped slightly on the welcome mat, performed a clumsy little hop-skip to regain her balance, and beamed at her neighbour's cat. "Morning, Barnaby. Don't get your paws wet." By the time she reached the gleaming glass tower of Sterling Global, she was slightly out of breath, and her hair a wild thicket of strawberry blonde curls was beginning to frizz in the humidity. She smoothed her skirt, took a deep breath, and stepped into the lift. The top floor was silent. It always felt like a library where everyone was afraid of the librarian. The carpets were so thick they swallowed the sound of her heels, and the air smelled of expensive sandalwood and very serious decisions. She reached the mahogany doors of the inner sanctum. She knocked twice. "Come," a voice barked. It was a deep voice, a heavy voice, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who had never once in his life accidentally eaten a burnt piece of toast. Poppy pushed the door open. Alistair Sterling was framed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, the grey London skyline behind him, making him look like a statue carved from granite. He was tall, terribly tall, with shoulders that seemed to take up far too much space. He didn't look up from his tablet. "You're 4 minutes late, Miss Higgins." I'm so sorry, Mr. Sterling." The district line was having a bit of a sulk, and then I saw a man trying to help a duck cross the road near the park, and I had to stop and make sure the duck made it, didn't I? It was a very determined duck. Alistair finally looked up. His eyes were the colour of a stormy sea grey-blue and piercing. He stared at her, his brow furrowing as if he were trying to solve a particularly difficult mathematical equation. He looked at her frizzing hair, her slightly crooked cardigan, and the smear of jam on her thumb that she hadn't noticed. "A duck," he repeated. "A mallard," she clarified, nodding firmly. "Very handsome, but quite stubborn." Alistair sighed, a sound like wind through a cavern. "Miss Higgins, I pay you to manage my schedule, not to act as a crossing guard for waterfowl. Sit down, we have the Mercer acquisition to finalize." Poppy sat. She pulled out her notebook, the one with the glittery unicorn on the cover that she'd bought, because it made her smile, and clicked her pen. For the next 3 hours, the room was filled with talk of shares, hostile takeovers, and legal boundaries. Poppy scribbled as fast as she could. Alistair was brilliant. She knew that. He was sharp and cold and efficient, but every time he looked at her, his gaze lingered just a second too long. It wasn't a soft look. It was the look of a man who liked to own things. He liked to own companies, buildings, and time, and lately, Poppy felt like he was trying to own her space, too. "You'll stay late tonight," he said. It wasn't a question. He was pacing now, his hands clasped behind his back. I need those documents filed by dawn. Oh, I was actually going to go to my pottery class, Poppy said, her voice small but hopeful. I'm making a bowl. It looks a bit like a squashed cabbage at the moment, but the teacher says it is character. Alistair stopped pacing. He leaned over her desk, his shadow falling over her like a dark velvet blanket. He was so close she could smell his cologne pepper and cedar. Cancel it, he said softly. His voice had lost its bark and gained something else, something heavy and possessive. I want you here, where I can see you. Poppy blinked. Her heart did a funny little somersault. Most girls would have found it frightening, or perhaps romantic in a dark, brooding sort of way. Poppy just thought he sounded lonely. Are you afraid of the dark, Mr. Sterling? She asked, her eyes wide and genuinely concerned. Because if you are, I have a little torch in my bag, or we could leave the hall lights on. Alistair froze. He stared at her, his jaw tightening. He looked as if he wanted to shake her or perhaps kiss her. The line between the two seemed very thin in that moment. I am not afraid of the dark, Miss Higgins, he bit out. I am simply particular about my environment, and you are a part of my environment. Like a plant, she asked, tilting her head. I hope I'm a sunflower. They're very hardy. He let out a sharp, frustrated breath and walked back to his window. Just do the work, Poppy, and stay. The evening wore on. The office emptied until it was just the two of them, suspended in the glass box high above the city. The rain began to lash against the windows, a rhythmic drumming that made the office feel smaller, more intimate. Poppy worked diligently. She filed, she typed, and she hummed. Around 8 p.m., she noticed Alistair hadn't moved from his desk. He was staring at a screen, his hand rubbing the back of his neck. He looked tired, not just long day tired, but long life tired. She stood up, padded into the little kitchenette, and made 2 mugs of tea. She didn't have fancy loose-leaf tea, just the sturdy builder's tea she liked. She added 2 sugars to his. She'd noticed he liked sweet things even though he pretended he didn't, and walked into his office. Tea break, she announced. Alistair looked up, startled. I didn't ask for tea. I know, that's the best kind of tea. The surprise kind. She set the mug down on his mahogany desk, right on top of a very expensive-looking report. He looked at the mug, then at her. You're still here. Well, you told me to be, she said simply, taking a sip of her own tea. And I don't mind. It's nice and dry in here. My roof at home has a little leak. I've named the puddle Kevin. Alistair's lips twitched. It wasn't a smile, not quite, but it was the ghost of one. You name everything, don't you? Ducks, puddles, notebooks. It makes the world feel friendlier, Poppy said, leaning against his desk, ignoring the hierarchy of the office. Don't you have names for things, besides assetter and liability B? Alistair leaned back in his leather chair, watching her. The way the lamplight caught the gold in her hair, the way she seemed utterly unimpressed by his wealth or his power. She was just Poppy. I don't have time for friendly, Poppy, he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. In my world, if you aren't careful, people take what you have, so I keep what is mine very, very close. I don't let it go. The anguish he carried was like a suit of armor he couldn't take off. Poppy saw it then. The way he looked at her wasn't just about control. It was about a man who was terrified of losing the only bright thing in his grey world. She reached out a brave, impulsive move and patted his hand. His skin was warm, his muscles tense. You can't hold onto water by squeezing it, Mr. Sterling, she said softly. You just have to cup in your hands and let it stay, because it wants to. He turned his hand over, catching her fingers in his. His grip was firm. And what if it wants to run away? Poppy laughed, a bright, bubbly sound that seemed to bounce off the cold glass walls. Why would I run away? You have much better biscuits here than I do at home. Those chocolate digestives in the break room, they're top tier. Alistair stared at her for a long beat. The intensity in his eyes was enough to melt lead. He pulled her hand slightly, drawing her closer until she was standing between his knees. The boundary was gone. The CEO and the assistant were just a man and a woman in the rain-soaked dark. "You're a very strange girl, Poppy Higgins," he whispered. "I prefer eclectic," she whispered back, her heart thumping like a drum. "It sounds more expensive." He didn't say anything else. He just leaned forward and rested his forehead against her stomach, closing his eyes. It was a gesture of such sudden, raw vulnerability that Poppy felt a lump form in her throat. He wasn't being a boss. He wasn't being a giant. He was just someone who needed a bit of sunshine. She rested her hands on his shoulders, her fingers brushing the fine wool of his suit. "It's all right, Alistair. I'm not going anywhere, unless there's a fire or a really big sale at the garden centre." He let out a muffled laugh against her. "Stay for dinner." "Is that a command, Mr. Sterling?" "No," he said, looking up at her, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "It's a request from a man who is very tired of eating alone." Poppy beamed. "Well, in that case, I'd love to. But only if we can go to that little Italian place around the corner. They give you free breadsticks if you tell them a joke." Alistair stood up, towering over her again, but this time it didn't feel like a shadow. It felt like a shield. He reached for his coat, then paused, looking at her yellow raincoat. "I don't know any jokes, Poppy." "That's all right," she said, tucking her arm through his, feeling the solid strength of him. "I know plenty. Did you hear the one about the man who went to the doctor with a strawberry on his head?" Alistair sighed, but there was a definite smile tugging at the corners of his mouth now. "No, Poppy, what happened?" "The doctor said, I can give you some cream for that." She laughed at her own joke, her head falling back, her curls bouncing. Alistair watched her, and for the first time in 10 years, he didn't think about acquisitions or boundaries or possession. He just thought about how much he liked the sound of her laughter. As they walked out of the office, the lights flicking off behind them, Poppy tripped over the door frame. Alistair caught her instantly, his arm wrapping around her waist, holding her steady. "Careful," he murmured, his voice thick with a new kind of heat. "I've got you," she said, patting his arm. "No," Alistair said, looking down at her as the lift doors closed, trapping them in a small, golden space. "I think I'm the one who's been caught." Poppy just smiled, adjusted her yellow coat, and wondered if he'd let her get the extra-large tiramisu for dessert. Life was a bit messy, and Alistair was a bit complicated, but the rain was falling, her heart was full, and she was fairly certain the duck from this morning had made it safely across the road. Everything was going to be just fine. The Italian restaurant was small, cramped, and smelled heavenly of garlic and basil. It was the exact opposite of Alistair's world. There were no white tablecloths here, only red and white checkered plastic, and the waiter, an elderly man named Marco, treated everyone like a long-lost cousin. "Alistair, you have to try the bruschetta," Poppy whispered, leaning across the table as if she were sharing a state secret. "It's like a party in your mouth, but everyone's invited." Alistair looked at the wooden board in front of him. He was used to Michelin-starred dining, where the portions were the size of a thimble, and the plates were wider than his head. This was rustic. "Poppy, there is enough garlic on this to ward off a legion of vampires," he noted, though he took a bite anyway. His eyes widened. He chewed slowly, his expression shifting from skepticism to genuine surprise. "Is it good?" she asked, her chin resting on her palms, her eyes bright with anticipation. "It is acceptable," he said, which in Alistair speak meant it was the best thing he'd tasted in a decade. They talked, or rather, Poppy talked and Alistair listened. She told him about her childhood in a small village in the Cotswolds, about her father who collected antique clocks that all ticked out of sync, and her mother who once tried to knit a jumper for a sheep. She told him about her dreams of owning a little flower shop where she'd give away free posies to people who look sad. Alistair found himself captivated. He'd spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him: money, influence, power. But Poppy, she just wanted him to hear about the sheep in the jumper. She was so unapologetically herself. She was messy and loud and kind. "Why me?" he asked suddenly, interrupting her story about a runaway bicycle. Poppy blinked. "Why you what? Why are you so nice to me? I'm not a pleasant man, Poppy. I'm demanding, I'm arrogant, and I've spent the last month trying to control every second of your day." Poppy grew quiet. She reached out and traced the pattern on the tablecloth. "Well," she said softly, "I think everyone has a reason for being the way they are. You're like a big, thorny hedge. Alistair, people see the thorns and they stay away. But thorns are just there to protect the things inside that are soft. I think you've just been protecting yourself for a very long time." Alistair felt a strange ache in his chest. It wasn't pain. It was the feeling of something frozen beginning to crack. "And you aren't afraid of the thorns?" "I've got thick gloves," she joked, but her eyes were sincere. "And besides, I like a challenge. My pottery teacher says I'm very persistent, even when the clay explodes in the kiln." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. This time, his grip wasn't about possession. It was about connection. "I don't want to be a challenge, Poppy, I just want." He stopped, the words catching in his throat. He didn't know how to say, "I want to be the reason you smile." He didn't know how to say, "I want to be the one who catches you when you trip, not because I own you, but because I can't bear to see you fall." "You want another breadstick?" Poppy suggested, her eyes twinkling. Alistair laughed a real, deep laugh that came from his stomach. "Yes, I want another breadstick." They walked back to her flat later that night. The rain had turned into a soft mist, turning the street lamps into glowing orbs of amber. When they reached her door, the old floorboards of the porch creaked a welcome. Poppy turned to face him. "Thank you for dinner, Alistair, and for not firing me for being late this morning." Alistair looked at her, his silhouette tall and imposing against the night, but his expression was soft. He reached out, his thumb brushing a stray curl away from her forehead. "I couldn't fire you, Poppy. The office would be far too quiet, and I'd have no one to tell me about determined ducks." He leaned down, his movement slow, giving her every chance to pull away. But Poppy didn't move. She stood on her tiptoes, her breath hitching as his lips met hers. The kiss was like Poppy herself, sweet, warm, and a little bit chaotic. It wasn't a corporate takeover. It was a merger of two very different worlds. It was the smell of rain and expensive cedar, the taste of garlic and joy. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark and intense. "This doesn't mean I'll let you be late tomorrow," he whispered, though his voice lacked any real bite. "I'll try my best," Poppy promised, her face flushed and beautiful. "But if I see a squirrel with a particularly interesting nut, I can't make any guarantees." Alistair shook his head, a small, genuine smile on his face. "Go inside, Poppy Higgins, before I decide to keep you here all night." "Good night, Alistair," she chirped, blowing him a kiss before disappearing inside. Alistair Sterling stood on the pavement for a long time after the door closed. He looked at the modest little flat, at the mismatched curtains and the dying geraniums in the window. He was a man who owned empires, but as he walked back to his car, he realized he'd never felt richer. He didn't need to possess her, he just needed to be near her. The next morning, Poppy's toast was burnt again, but as she scraped the charcoal into the sink, she wasn't humming a tune from the wireless. She was humming a song Alistair had mentioned he liked. She grabbed her yellow raincoat, tripped over the rug, and headed out into the London morning. The sky was grey, the tube was delayed, and she was almost certainly going to be late. But she didn't mind, because she knew that when she walked into that big glass office, there would be a man waiting for her. A man with thorns and a heavy heart and a very secret stash of chocolate digestives. And that was more than enough for Poppy. The London Underground was a beast of its own making on a Tuesday morning, a subterranean labyrinth of damp coats, folded newspapers, and the collective rhythmic sigh of people who would much rather be back in bed with a hot water bottle. Poppy Higgins, however, was not sighing. She was vibrating with a sort of frantic, fizzy energy that made the elderly gentleman sitting next to her look up from his crossword with a mixture of concern and mild annoyance. She had a smudge of marmalade on her sleeve, and one of her socks was inside out. She could feel the seam rubbing against her toes in a way that was quite distracting, but she didn't care. Not one bit. She was thinking about the kiss. It hadn't been a cinematic kiss, not really. There were no violins, and the rain had mostly just made her nose drip, but it had felt like... Well, it had felt like finding the missing piece of a very complicated jigsaw puzzle. The sort of puzzle that looks like it's just a picture of a clear blue sky, where every piece is the same shade of impossible. Alistair Sterling was that sky vast, intimidating, and occasionally very cold, but for a few seconds on her doorstep, he had been warm, he had been human. "Excuse me, sorry, terribly sorry," Poppy chirped, squeezing past a wall of broad-shouldered commuters as the train screeched into Canary Wharf. She accidentally stepped on a very expensive-looking brogue, offered a horrified squeak of an apology, and tumbled out onto the platform. The walk to the Sterling Holdings skyscraper was a blur of glass and steel. To anyone else, the building was a monument to corporate power, a jagged needle of ambition piercing the grey London clouds. To Poppy, it was just the place where the man with the secret chocolate biscuits lived. She hurried through the revolving doors, her yellow raincoat flapping like the wings of a particularly clumsy canary. "Morning, Mrs. Gable," she called out to the formidable woman at the reception desk. Mrs. Gable, who usually possessed the temperament of a gargoyle guarding a cathedral, actually cracked a microscopic smile. "You're 7 minutes late, Higgins," Mrs. Gable noted. Though her tone lacked its usual serrated edge, the dragon is in his lair, and he's already asked for coffee twice. Poppy winced, her hand flying to her messy bun. 7 minutes isn't too bad. It's practically early in some cultures. Probably. I'll go and soothe the beast immediately. She scurried towards the lifts, her heart doing a little tap dance against her ribs. When she reached the top floor, the silence was absolute, muffled by carpets so thick they felt like walking on moss. This was Alistair's world, ordered, silent, and impeccably controlled. It was a world that usually made Poppy feel like she was a bull in a china shop, or perhaps more accurately, a very confused kitten in a high-tech laboratory. She pushed open the heavy oak doors to his outer office, shedding her wet coat and hanging it on the rack where it looked positively garish next to his charcoal overcoats. She quickly prepared his coffee black, strong enough to wake the dead, and served in the plain white mug he preferred because he claimed patterns were distracting. With a deep breath and a quick pat of her hair, she knocked on the inner sanctum. "Come," a voice barked. It was the old Alistair. The I-own-half-of-city Alistair. Poppy entered, the tray wobbling slightly in her hands. Alistair was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her. His jacket was off, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that Poppy had recently discovered were very, very firm. He didn't turn around. "You're late," he said. The words were sharp, but there was a strange tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there yesterday. I know, Poppy said, setting the coffee down on his desk with a soft clink. There was a very stubborn pigeon on the tracks at Bermondsey. Everyone was huffing and puffing, but I thought he looked quite dignified, really, like he was protesting the speed of modern life. Alistair turned then. His eyes were dark, shadowed by a lack of sleep, and they searched her face with an intensity that made her breath hitch. He didn't look angry. He looked bothered, as if he had spent the night trying to solve an equation that simply wouldn't balance. "A pigeon," he repeated flatly. A very brave one, she insisted, offering him a small, hopeful smile. How are you this morning, Alistair? Did you sleep well? You look a bit rumpled, in a very handsome, brooding sort of way, obviously. Alistair stared at her. He felt the familiar urge to reclaim his dominance, to snap at her about punctuality and professional boundaries. He wanted to remind her that he was the CEO and she was his assistant. He wanted to build the hedge back up, thorn by thorn, because the vulnerability he felt right now was terrifying. It was a physical weight in his chest, a soft, thrumming pulse that made it hard to think about mergers and acquisitions. I didn't sleep at all, he admitted, his voice dropping an octave. He stepped away from the window, moving toward her until he was standing just on the other side of the desk. I spent the night wondering if I'd imagined the last 12 hours. I spent the night trying to convince myself that I shouldn't have kissed you. Poppy's smile softened. She moved around the desk, ignoring the invisible line that usually separated them. She didn't stop until she was close enough to smell the cedarwood and expensive soap that always clung to him. And did you, she asked softly, convince yourself? I mean, Alistair looked down at her. She was so small, so bright, and so completely out of place in this cold, grey room. He reached out, his hand hovering near her waist before he caught himself. The old instinct, the one that wanted to pull her in and never let her go, to lock the door and keep her away from the rest of the world, flared up like a fever. He wanted to possess her joy. He wanted to be the only person allowed to see it. But then he remembered the way she had looked at him last night, not with fear, but with a kind of gentle pity that had stripped away his armor. No, he said, his voice rough. I failed miserably. I think you're a very bad influence on my productivity, Poppy Higgins. I think I'm a wonderful influence, she countered, her eyes twinkling. I think I'm the only thing keeping you from turning into a very expensive statue. She reached out and boldly straightened his tie, her fingers brushing against the silk. Alistair froze, his breath hitching. The sheer audacity of her, this girl who had nothing, challenging a man who had everything, never ceased to amaze him. I have a meeting with the board in 10 minutes, he muttered, though he made no move to pull away. Then you'll need this, she said, reaching into the pocket of her cardigan and pulling out a small, slightly squashed paper bag. It's a jammy dodger, for luck, and because you're a bit grumpy when you're hungry. Alistair looked at the biscuit as if she'd handed him a piece of radioactive waste. I don't eat jammy dodgers in board meetings, Poppy. Well, you should. It would make Mr. Henderson much more agreeable. He looks like a man who hasn't had a proper biscuit since the mid-90s. Alistair felt the corner of his mouth twitch, the tension in his chest eased, just a fraction. This was the possessive boundary he was learning to navigate, not the boundary of keeping her in, but the boundary of letting himself out. He took the biscuit, his fingers lingering against hers for a second longer than necessary. Get back to your desk, he said, though there was no heat in the command, and try not to start any fires while I'm gone. I can't make any promises. The stapler has been looking at me quite suspiciously, she called out as she retreated, her laughter trailing behind her like a ribbon. The morning progressed in a whirlwind of corporate drudgery, but for Alistair, the atmosphere had shifted. Every time he looked through the glass walls of his office, he saw her. He saw her struggling with the photocopier, her tongue poked out in concentration. He saw her chatting animatedly with the delivery man, who left looking significantly happier than when he'd arrived. He found himself checking his watch, not to see how much time was left in his meeting, but to see how long it would be until lunch. He found himself distracted by the way the sunlight caught the gold in her hair. It was a dangerous distraction. Around 2 o'clock, Julian Vane arrived. Julian was a venture capitalist with a smile that was a little too white and a reputation for being a charmer. He was in the office to discuss a joint venture in renewable energy, but the moment he stepped into the reception area, His eyes narrowed on Poppy. Alistair, watching from his desk, felt a cold, sharp spike of jealousy pierce through him. It was an old, ugly feeling, the territorial growl of a man who didn't like other people touching his things. She isn't a thing, he reminded himself, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his pen. She isn't yours to guard. But as he watched Julian lean over Poppy's desk, laughing at something she said, and letting his hand rest a little too close to hers on the mahogany surface, Alistair's resolve wavered. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. He didn't think, he simply moved. He swung the door open and stepped out into the main office, his presence immediately cooling the air. "Vane," Alistair said, his voice like a glacier, "you're early." Julian looked up, his grin unfaltering. "Alistair, just getting to know your charming assistant. I was just telling her that Sterling Holdings is far too grey for someone with such vibrant energy." He turned back to Poppy, his eyes roaming over her face in a way that made Alistair want to throw him out of the window. "I don't suppose you'd be interested in a career change, Miss Higgins. My firm is looking for someone with exactly your aesthetic." Poppy blinked, looking between the two men. She could feel the electricity crackling between them, Alistair's silent, simmering fury and Julian's oily confidence. She felt like a very small bird caught between two very large cats. "Oh, I think I'd be terrible at venture capitalism," Poppy said, her voice bright but a little nervous. "I'm very bad at maths. I once tried to calculate a tip and ended up accidentally paying for the whole table's dinner. It was a very expensive mistake. But the waiter was able to buy his daughter a new bicycle, so it wasn't all bad." Julian laughed, a rich, performative sound. "See, heart of gold, truly wasted here, Alistair." Alistair stepped forward, stepping into Julian's personal space with a calculated elegance. He was taller, broader, and infinitely more dangerous. "Miss Higgins is currently occupied with a very important project, Julian, one that requires her specific talents. Now, shall we move to the conference room? My time is, as you know, quite expensive." Julian held up his hands in a mock gesture of surrender, though his eyes remained on Poppy as he walked away. Of course, duty calls. I'll see you later, Poppy, perhaps for a drink when you're finished with the ogre." The door to the conference room shut with a finality that echoed in the quiet office. Poppy sat back in her chair, her heart thumping. She looked at the closed door, then at her computer screen, which was currently displaying a screensaver of a dancing hamster. She felt a strange mixture of emotions. She wasn't an idiot. She knew Alistair had been protecting her. Part of her, the part that had grown up feeling small and overlooked, found it strangely thrilling. To have a man like Alistair Sterling stand up for her, to see that flicker of possessive fire in his eyes, it was intoxicating. But another part of her, the part that valued her independence and her silly, messy freedom, felt a twinge of worry. Alistair was a man who moved mountains to get what he wanted. And right now, it felt very much like he wanted her, not just as an assistant, and not just as a girlfriend, but as something he could curate and protect. The meeting lasted for 2 hours. When Julian finally left, he didn't stop to talk to Poppy. He just gave her a wink and a wave as he headed for the lifts. A few minutes later, Alistair emerged. He looked exhausted. He walked over to Poppy's desk and stood there, looking down at her. The anger was gone, replaced by a weary sort of vulnerability. "I'm sorry," he said. The word seemed to cost him a great deal. Poppy looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For being a bit of a grump to Mr. Vane. I thought he was a bit much. Honestly, too much teeth." Alistair sat on the edge of her desk, an uncharacteristically casual gesture. "I'm sorry for wanting to snap his neck. I'm sorry for the way I reacted. I told you, Poppy, I'm a demanding man when I see something I value. My first instinct is to build a wall around it, to make sure no one else can touch it." He looked at his hands, his expression pained. "I don't want to do that to you." You aren't a painting in a gallery, you aren't a company to be acquired. But it's hard, it's a very old habit. Poppy reached out and took his hand. His skin was hot, his pulse thrumming beneath his wrist. Alistair, I like that you want to protect me. I really do. It makes me feel... Well, it makes me feel like I'm not just a girl who burns her toast and trips over her own feet. She squeezed his hand, her gaze steady. But you have to trust me. I'm very good at dealing with too much teeth. I've dealt with grumpy landlords, angry bus drivers, and a very aggressive swan in Hyde Park. I can handle a venture capitalist. Alistair looked at her, and for a moment, the CEO was gone. He was just a man, lost in the bright, unwavering light of her sincerity. A swan? He asked, a small smile playing on his lips. It wanted my sandwich, she said solemnly. I had to use my umbrella as a shield. It was a very noble battle. Alistair laughed, and the sound seemed to blow away the last of the afternoon's tension. He stood up, pulling her with him. For a second, they stood in the middle of the office, surrounded by the ghosts of corporate ambition, and they were the only two people in the world. Come on, he said, the sun is actually trying to come out. Let's go for a walk, somewhere without swans. What about work? Poppy asked, her eyes wide. We have at least 3 more hours of whatever it is we do here. I own the building, Poppy. I think I can grant us a leave of absence. They walked through the streets of London as the city began to transition into its evening hum. The air was crisp, smelling of damp stone and roasting chestnuts from a nearby street vendor. They walked through St. James's Park, the trees gold and auburn against the pale sky. Alistair felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the next deal or the next threat. He was just watching the way Poppy jumped over the cracks in the pavement and the way she stopped to point out a particularly fat squirrel. You're doing it again, Poppy said suddenly, stopping by a bridge over the lake. Doing what? Thinking about the hedge. You're walking like you're expecting someone to jump out and steal me. Alistair sighed, leaning against the stone railing. Is it that obvious? You're very stiff, Alistair, like you've swallowed a ruler. Relax, look at the ducks. They aren't worried about venture capitalists. The ducks don't have a board of directors to answer to, he muttered, but he consciously forced his shoulders to drop. He looked out over the water, the reflections of the city lights beginning to shimmer on the surface. Poppy, I've spent my whole life making sure I had the upper hand, in every room. In every relationship. It's how I survived. My father was. He was a man who believed that love was just another form of leverage. Poppy stayed quiet, sensing the weight of the confession. When he died, he didn't leave me a legacy, Alistair continued, his voice low. He left me a list of people he'd crushed. He wanted me to be like him, cold, immovable, and for a long time, I thought that if I owned everything, nothing could hurt me. He turned to look at her, his eyes raw. Then you walked into my office with your burnt toast and your stories about ducks, and I realized I didn't own anything at all, because I didn't have the one thing that actually mattered. Poppy felt a lump in her throat. She stepped closer, resting her head against his arm. And what's that? Connection, he whispered, the kind that doesn't require a contract. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. It was a quiet moment, a small victory in the long war Alistair was fighting with himself. As they walked back toward the lights of the city, Poppy tripped. It was a classic Poppy move-astray pebble, a slight lapse in concentration, and she was heading for the gravel. Alistair's hand shot out instantly, his fingers catching her arm and pulling her back against him before she could hit the ground. His grip was firm, certain. Careful, he breathed, his heart hammering against her back. Poppy leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his chest, the steady beat of his heart. She turned in his arms, looking up at him with a mischievous glint in her eyes. "See," she whispered, "I told you. You're very good at catching me. You don't need to hold me tight all the time, Alistair. Just when I'm about to fall." Alistair looked down at her, the London night reflecting in her eyes. He felt the old urge to pull her closer, to tuck her under his coat and carry her away from the world. But he didn't. He loosened his grip, his hand sliding down to rest gently on her waist. "I'm learning, Poppy," he said, his voice soft. "I'm a slow learner, but I'm trying." "I'm a very patient teacher," she promised, "as long as you keep the jammy dodgers coming." He kissed her then, right there in the middle of the park, with the evening commuters rushing past and the ducks quacking in the distance. It wasn't a kiss of possession, it was a promise. When they finally reached her flat, the air was cold, but Poppy felt as if she were wrapped in a woolen blanket. Alistair walked her to the door, waiting until she had her keys out. "I'll see you tomorrow, Poppy Higgins," he said, "on time, hopefully. I'll be there unless I see a particularly interesting cloud." Alistair laughed, a sound that was becoming more frequent, more natural. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a gentle, lingering touch. "Good night, Poppy." "Good night, Alistair." She watched him walk away, his silhouette tall and strong under the street lamps. He didn't look back, but she saw the way he paused at the end of the street, looking up at the moon for a long moment before disappearing around the corner. Poppy went inside, her flat feeling smaller and humbler than ever, but filled with a new kind of light. She kicked off her shoes, the one with the inside-out sock, and went to the kitchen. She looked at the toaster, she looked at the bread. She decided to have a jammy dodger instead. As she sat on her mismatched sofa, nibbling on the biscuit, she thought about the man in the glass tower. She thought about his thorns and his heavy heart. And she thought about the way he had caught her when she fell. He was still Alistair Sterling. He was still arrogant, and he was still a little bit fond of control, but the ice was melting. And Poppy Higgins, with her yellow raincoat and her burnt toast, was the one holding the sun. She fell asleep that night with a smile on her face, dreaming of a world where ducks wore suits, and even the grumpiest of men knew how to dance in the rain. The next morning, the sun actually rose over London. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, and the birds in the park were singing as if they'd been paid for the performance. Poppy woke up early. She didn't burn the toast. She even found matching socks. She arrived at the office 5 minutes before her shift started. Mrs. Gable looked up, her eyebrows disappearing into her hairline. "Early, Higgins, is the world ending?" "Not at all, Mrs. Gable. It's just beginning," Poppy chirped, heading for the coffee machine. She walked into Alistair's office with a fresh cup of coffee and a sprig of jasmine she'd picked from a bush near her flat. She set them down on his desk, next to a stack of very serious-looking reports. Alistair looked up. He looked rested. He looked happy. "Good morning, Poppy," he said, his voice warm. "Good morning, Alistair. I brought you a flower. It's for inspiration." He picked up the jasmine, smelling its delicate scent. He looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a challenge to be conquered or a treasure to be guarded. He saw a partner. "Thank you," he said softly. He didn't mention the board meeting. He didn't mention the reports. He just sat there in his multi-million-pound office, holding a small white flower and watching the girl who had changed everything. The hedge was still there, perhaps, but the gate was open, and for the first time in his life, Alistair Sterling wasn't afraid to let someone in. But as the morning wore on, a different kind of shadow began to loom. A phone call from New York, a whispered conversation in the hallway, and the arrival of a woman Alistair hadn't seen in 5 years, a woman who represented everything he used to be. Poppy, watching from her desk, felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She saw the way Alistair's face hardened when he saw the visitor. She saw the way the woman, elegant, sharp, and dressed in a suit that cost more than Poppy's entire flat, looked at Alistair with an ownership that was far more chilling than anything Alistair had ever shown. The boundary of possession was about to be tested in a way neither of them expected. And as the door to Alistair's office clicked shut, leaving Poppy on the outside, she realized that some thorns were much deeper than she'd imagined. The clicking of those heels was unlike any sound Poppy had ever heard in the offices of Sterling Global. They didn't just tap, they commanded the floor to stay still. They were sharp, rhythmic, and terrifyingly expensive. Poppy sat at her desk, her hand frozen over a stapler, as the woman swept past. She smelled of sandalwood and something cold like a mountainside in a perfume bottle. "Alistair is expecting me," the woman said, not to Poppy, but to the air generally, as if the oxygen itself were her personal assistant. Mrs. Gable, who usually possessed the temperament of a badger guarding a burrow, actually stood up. "Of course, Miss Vance. He's just finishing a call. Would you like some Darjeeling?" Miss Vance didn't answer. She simply pushed open the heavy oak door to Alistair's private sanctuary and disappeared inside. The click of the lock sounded, to Poppy's ears, like a tiny guillotine. Poppy looked down at her desk. She had spent the last 20 minutes trying to make a paperclip chain in the shape of a heart, but now it just looked like a tangled mess of wire. The sprig of jasmine she had given Alistair earlier was still on his desk. She'd seen it through the glass before the blinds were drawn, but suddenly it felt very small and very fragile. "Who was that Mrs. Gable?" Poppy whispered, leaning over the partition. "She looks like she owns the moon." Mrs. Gable sighed, a sound like a deflating bicycle tire. "That Higgins is Seraphina Vance. Her father and Mr. Sterling's father were partners. They grew up together. In certain circles, it was always assumed they'd well. That they'd merge more than just their portfolios." Merge? Poppy felt a strange, wobbly sensation in her knees. "You mean like a bank?" "No, dear, like a dynasty." Mrs. Gable gave her a look that was surprisingly pitying. "Go and make some copies, Poppy, busy hands, and all that." Poppy went to the photocopier, but she didn't make any copies. She just stood there, watching the green light slide back and forth, back and forth. It felt like a scanner trying to find her heart and finding it missing. She thought about the night before the moon, the walk, the way Alistair had looked at her as if she were the only person in London who mattered. But Seraphina Vance didn't look like she belonged in a world of burnt toast and yellow raincoats. She looked like she belonged in the glass tower. She looked like the thorns that Alistair had grown to protect himself. Inside the office, the silence was thick enough to choke on. Alistair stood by the window, his back to the door. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The scent of her was a ghost he'd tried to exorcise for half a decade. "You've redecorated," Seraphina said, her voice a smooth, low cello. "It's a bit clinical, isn't it? You used to love velvet." "I grew up," Seraphina, Alistair said, finally turning. He looked at her, the perfect tailoring, the diamond studs that cost more than a council house, the eyes that never truly warmed. "What are you doing in London? The Manhattan merger isn't due for another 6 months." "I missed the rain," she lied, stepping closer. She noticed the sprig of jasmine on his desk. Her lip curled almost imperceptibly. "And I heard a rumour that the Lion of London had been tamed by what was the word? A whimsical little thing." Alistair's jaw tightened. "Poppy is my assistant." "Is she? She looks like a lost Sunday school teacher who wandered into a boardroom by mistake." Seraphina picked up the jasmine between two manicured fingers and dropped it into the waste paper basket. "You're making a spectacle of yourself. Alistair, your board is talking. Your mother is worried. You've always had a streak of possessiveness, but usually you pick things worth keeping." Alistair felt a surge of cold fury, but it was dampened by a crushing weight of expectation. Seraphina wasn't just a woman, she was a mirror. She reflected the man he had been raised to be, the man who viewed relationships as acquisitions and emotions as liabilities. "She's different," Alistair said, though his voice sounded hollow even to himself. "She's a distraction," Seraphina countered. "And you know as well as I do that Sterling Global cannot afford distractions right now. We have a legacy to protect. We have the merger. And you have me. If you'd stop playing at being a commoner." Out in the main office, Poppy was trying to be brave. She decided that the best way to combat a mountain perfume lady was to be extra poppyish. She went to the communal kitchen and found a tin of biscuits she'd brought in custard creams. She arranged them on a plate in the shape of a sun. "I'll just take them in," she thought. "Alistair likes custard creams. Everyone likes custard creams. They're the peacemakers of the biscuit world." She approached the office door. She could hear voices, but not the words. Taking a deep breath, she knocked. "Come in," Alistair's voice barked. It wasn't the warm voice from the morning. It was the glass tower voice. Poppy pushed the door open, her smile pinned firmly to her face. "I thought you might be a bit peckish. I've brought the emergency biscuits. They're very good for morale." The room felt like an icebox. Seraphina Vance was leaning against Alistair's desk, her hand resting dangerously close to his. She looked at Poppy as if she were a particularly interesting species of beetle. "Biscuits," Seraphina echoed, her eyebrows arching. "How quaint." Alistair didn't look at the plate. He didn't look at the sun-shaped arrangement. He looked at Poppy, but his eyes were guarded, shielded behind layers of steel. "Not now, Poppy," he said. "We're in the middle of something important." "Oh, right, of course." Poppy felt her face burning. The custard creams suddenly felt very silly. She felt very silly. I'll leave them here." "Take them out, Higgins," Alistair said, his voice flat, and closed the door. Poppy's heart did a slow, painful somersault. Higgins, he hadn't called her that since the day she'd accidentally dyed his white shirts pink in the office laundry. She turned around, her vision blurring just a tiny bit around the edges. As she walked out, she heard Seraphina's low, melodic laugh. "She's charming, Alistair, like a pet, but one doesn't bring pets to the opera." Poppy sat back at her desk. The sun was still shining outside, but the light felt cold. She looked at her mismatched socks. One was bright yellow with polka dots, and the other was a plain, dull grey. She had thought it was funny this morning. Now, it just felt like a metaphor. She was the polka dot, and the world of Alistair Sterling was the grey. And the two didn't really belong together, did they? The afternoon dragged on like a slow-motion car crash. Seraphina and Alistair eventually emerged from the office. They were headed to lunch at a place called the Gilded Cage or something equally fancy that required a tie and a soul-crushing bill. As they walked past Poppy's desk, Seraphina paused. She reached out and adjusted a stray lock of Alistair's hair, a gesture so intimate and so full of ownership that it made Poppy's breath hitch. "See you later, dear," Seraphina said to Poppy, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Do try not to spill any tea on the important papers while we're gone." Alistair didn't look back. He followed her to the lift, his shoulders straight, his face a mask of professional indifference. Poppy waited until the lift doors hissed shut. Then she slowly reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a packet of sherbet lemons. She popped one into her mouth. It was sour, so sour it made her eyes water. That was her excuse. Anyway, if anyone saw her crying, it was definitely the sherbet lemon's fault. "He's just busy, Poppy," she whispered to herself. "He's a very busy man with a very big company and a very scary lady friend. It's fine, everything is tickety-boo." But it wasn't tickety-boo. For the next 3 days, the old Alistair returned with a vengeance. He was cold, he was demanding, and he was constantly flanked by Seraphina. They went to dinners, they attended galas, and their names were splashed across the society pages of the papers. The Sterling Vance Union, a match made in corporate heaven. Poppy was relegated to the shadows. She was no longer the girl who brought him jasmine. She was the girl who filed his folders and made sure his dry cleaning was picked up. He barely spoke to her, and when he did, it was always about work. The ice hadn't just returned, it had frozen over the entire building. On Thursday evening, it started to rain, not the lovely, dancing rain that Poppy liked, but a miserable, grey drizzle that turned the London streets into a slushy mess. Poppy was leaving the office late, her yellow raincoat feeling heavy and useless. She was waiting for the bus when a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down, and Alistair's face appeared. He looked tired. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "Get in, Poppy," he said. "I'm fine, Mr. Sterling. The bus is coming." "Poppy, get in the car." It wasn't a request, it was that old, possessive command. She sighed and climbed into the back seat. The interior smelled of leather and him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The driver, a silent man named Arthur, kept his eyes on the road. "Seraphina is leaving for New York tomorrow," Alistair said abruptly. "Oh, that's nice for her. I hear the bagels are excellent there." Poppy stared out of the window, watching the raindrops race each other down the glass. "She wants me to go with her, permanently." Poppy's heart stopped. She didn't want to ask, but the words tumbled out anyway. "And are you?" Alistair turned to look at her. In the dim light of the car, his eyes were unreadable. "She represents everything I'm supposed to want. Stability, power, a partner who understands the weight of this world." "She's very shiny," Poppy agreed softly, "like a new kettle. But she's a bit sharp at the edges, isn't she?" Alistair let out a short, dry laugh. "She's a blade, Poppy, and I've spent my whole life trying to be one, too." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the seat, but he didn't quite touch her. "But then you came along with your burnt toast and your ducks, and suddenly, I don't want to be a blade anymore. I want to be, I don't know, a person," Poppy suggested. "People are much nicer than blades. You can't use a person to cut a steak, but you can give them a hug." Alistair's expression softened, the ice cracking just a fraction. "I've been a coward this week, Poppy. I let her talk to you that way. I let her make me feel ashamed of the only thing that's made me smile in years." Poppy looked at him, her eyes wide and honest. "You don't have to be ashamed, Alistair. I know I'm a bit much. I know I don't fit in the glass tower. I'm more of a garden shed type of person, useful for storing flower pots and old bicycles." "You are not a garden shed," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a low, intense growl. He finally moved his hand, lacing his fingers with hers. His grip was tight, possessive, yes, but also desperate. "You are the only thing in this city that feels real. But what about the merger, and your mother, and the dynasty?" Alistair leaned in closer, his forehead resting against hers. "Let them have the dynasty. I just want the girl in the yellow raincoat." It was a beautiful moment. It was a movie moment. It was the kind of moment that deserved a swelling orchestra and a slow-motion kiss. But then Alistair's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. His face went pale. "What is it?" Poppy asked, her stomach knotting. "It's Seraphina," he whispered. "She's at your flat, Poppy." Poppy blinked. "My flat? Why, I haven't even tidied up. There's a pile of laundry on the chair that looks like a small mountain range." "She's not there for tea," Alistair said, his voice turning cold again. But this time, the cold wasn't directed at Poppy. It was a protective, dangerous chill. "She knows, Poppy. She knows you're the reason I'm staying. And Seraphina Vance doesn't lose. If she can't have the prize, she destroys the competition. But I'm not a prize. I'm just Poppy." "To me, you are everything," Alistair said, grabbing his phone and barking orders at the driver. "Arthur, get us to Brixton. Now, run every red light if you have to." The car roared to life, swerving into the traffic. Poppy gripped Alistair's hand, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She thought of her little flat, with its mismatched cushions and its leaky tap. It had always been her safe place. But now, the woman of steel was there, and Poppy realized that the boundary of possession wasn't just about Alistair wanting her, it was about who had the right to claim his soul. As the car screeched around a corner, Alistair pulled her close, his arm wrapping around her shoulders like a shield. "Don't be afraid," he whispered into her hair. "I won't let her touch you." "I'm not afraid for me," Poppy said, looking up at him with tear-filled eyes. "I'm afraid for you, because if you choose me, Alistair, you lose everything else." Alistair looked out at the blurred lights of London, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. "Then I'll be the luckiest man in the world," he said, "because I'll finally have something that isn't for sale." They arrived at the flat to find the front door ajar. The hallway light was flickering. Poppy's heart plummeted. She ran up the stairs, Alistair right behind her. They burst into the tiny living room. Seraphina was sitting on the mismatched sofa, looking entirely out of place in her silk suit. She was holding a small, framed photograph that Poppy kept on the mantelpiece, a picture of Poppy's parents at the seaside. "It's a very small life, isn't it?" Seraphina said, not looking up. "So easy to break." "Put it down, Seraphina," Alistair commanded, his voice vibrating with a threat that made even Poppy flinch. Seraphina looked up, a cold, triumphant smile on her face. "I was just telling your little friend's landlord about the irregularities in her lease. It's amazing what a few well-placed phone calls can do, Alistair, by tomorrow morning. This safe place won't exist, and by tomorrow afternoon, your board will receive a file detailing exactly how much company time and money you've spent on this distraction." She stood up, smoothing her skirt. "You can have her, Alistair, but you'll have her in the gutter, because I will strip you of every penny, every share, and every ounce of respect you have in this city. Is she worth that much?" The room went silent. The only sound was the rain drumming against the window pane. Poppy looked at Alistair. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the decades of ambition, the weight of his father's legacy, the sheer power he held in his hands. She felt a lump in her throat. She loved him. She really, truly did. And because she loved him, she knew what she had to do. "Alistair," she whispered, stepping forward. "It's okay. You don't have to choose. I'll go. I'll move back to my aunt's in the country. You stay here. You keep your tower." Alistair turned to her. He looked at her honest, sweet-faced, the face of the girl who thought custard creams could fix a broken heart. "Poppy Higgins," he said softly, "you really are a bit of a donkey sometimes." He turned back to Seraphina. He took the photograph from her hand and placed it gently back on the mantelpiece. Then he took his mobile phone out of his pocket and dropped it into Poppy's half-full cup of cold tea. Plop. "The board meeting starts at 9, Alistair said, his voice calm and terrifyingly steady. "Tell them I won't be there. Tell them I've resigned. And tell my mother. Tell her I've finally found something worth keeping." Seraphina's face turned a mottled shade of purple. "You're insane. You're throwing away an empire for a girl who wears inside-out socks." "Yes," Alistair said, a genuine, beautiful smile breaking across his face, "and I've never felt more like a king." He walked over to Poppy, took her face in his hands, and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of defiance. It was a kiss that broke the last of the ice. Seraphina let out a hiss of pure venom and stormed out of the flat, her heels clattering down the stairs like a retreating army. Poppy pulled back, breathless. "Alistair, your phone. It's in the tea. It's going to be all sticky." Alistair laughed aloud, boisterous sound that filled the tiny room. "Let it be sticky, Poppy. I don't want to talk to anyone but you anyway." He looked around the humble flat, the peeling wallpaper, the pile of laundry, the tiny kitchen. Then he looked at the girl in the yellow raincoat. "So," he said, pulling her into his arms, "do you think your aunt has room for a former CEO? I'm quite good at filing, and I'm learning how to make toast." Poppy beamed, her heart overflowing with a joy so bright it could have lit up all of London. I think she'd like that very much. But Alistair, yes, Poppy, we're definitely going to have to do something about your tie. It's far too serious for the countryside. Alistair reached up, pulled the silk tie from his neck, and tossed it onto the pile of laundry. Consider it gone. And there, in the middle of a messy flat in Brixton, the man who had everything finally realized he'd had nothing at all until he found the girl who had nothing but everything to give. The boundary of possession had been crossed, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a cage. It felt like home. The tea was now officially ruined. It was Earl Grey, which Poppy usually saved for fancy days, but now it tasted of lithium batteries and corporate resignation. She fished the dripping mobile out with a slotted spoon, her nose wrinkling. It's definitely dead, Alistair. It's gone to the great big car park in the sky, she whispered, holding the device like a wet sparrow. Alistair didn't look at the phone. He didn't look at the expensive silk tie lying amongst her mismatched socks. He looked at her, really looked at her. For years, his world had been made of glass and steel, measured in quarterly increments, and the sharp, cold taste of expensive scotch. Now, the air in the cramped Brixton flat felt thick and warm, smelling of damp wool and the lavender detergent Poppy used. Good, he said, and he meant it. I hope it never rings again. They didn't wait for the morning. Seraphina's threats were like a ticking clock, and Alistair knew that once the sun rose, the lawyers would descend like vultures. He didn't want a legal battle. He didn't want to fight for a throne he'd realized was made of ice. Right then, Poppy chirped, clapping her hands together. The sound was bright, like a party popper. Operation Great Escape is a go. We need to pack the essentials, my knitting, the toasted sandwich maker, and Brian. Alistair paused, a suitcase he'd bought in Milan in his hand. Who is Brian? Poppy pointed to a very small, very disgruntled-looking cactus sitting on the windowsill. It was wearing a tiny, hand-wear-upon bobble hat. He's sensitive to drafts. We can't leave him to Seraphina. She'd probably turn him into a cocktail garnish. Alistair looked at the cactus. He looked at his bespoke suits hanging in the hallway. Then he looked at Poppy, who was currently trying to fit a giant, fluffy flamingo cushion into a bean bag. He laughed again. It was a rusty sound, like a gate that hadn't been opened in a decade. Brian stays with us, Alistair decreed. They packed the car his sleek, silver Aston Martin, which looked absurdly out of place parked next to a skip on a rainy London street. They stuffed the boot with Poppy's life, bags of yarn, books with door-geared pages, a collection of vintage teapots, and, of course, Brian the cactus. Alistair's contribution was a single leather bag and the clothes on his back. He'd left the keys to his penthouse on the kitchen counter, next to a half-eaten packet of digestive biscuits. As they drove away, London began to blur into a smear of orange street lights and grey drizzle. Poppy sat in the passenger seat, her knees tucked up to her chin, humming a song that sounded suspiciously like the theme to a children's television show. "Are you scared?" she asked suddenly. Her eyes were wide and honest, reflecting the lights of the M3. Alistair gripped the steering wheel. For the first time in his life, he didn't have a 5-year plan. He didn't have a board of directors to answer to. He had a bank account that Seraphina was currently trying to freeze and a girl who believed in magic. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "I don't know how to be normal, Poppy. I don't know how to exist without a schedule." Poppy reached over and patted his hand. Her touch was warm and slightly sticky from a rogue jelly baby she'd found in her pocket. "Normal is boring, Alistair. We're going for delightfully chaotic. It's much better for the complexion." By the time they reached the village of Little Wallop in Hampshire, the sun was beginning to peek through the clouds like a shy golden coin. The village was exactly what Alistair expected: thatched cottages, a pub called the Fat Goose, and a telephone box that had been converted into a library. Aunt Martha's cottage was at the very end of a winding lane, smothered in climbing roses that looked like they were trying to eat the chimney. Martha herself was waiting on the porch, wearing a cardie that had more colours than a rainbow and holding a plate of scones. "Poppy, my little button," Martha cried, engulfing Poppy in a hug that smelled of flower and peppermint. She peered over Poppy's shoulder at Alistair, who was standing awkwardly by the car, still wearing his £1,000 shoes in the mud. "And who's this? He looks a bit peaky," Martha noted, squinting through her spectacles. "Too much city air, not enough fibre, I'll wager." "This is Alistair, Auntie," Poppy said, beaming. "He's retired." "Retired? At his age? How lovely," Martha tutted. "Well, come in, come in. The kettle's on, and the cat's been informed of your arrival. He's not pleased, but he'll come round for a bit of ham." The cottage was a maze of low ceilings and creaky floorboards. Alistair had to duck to avoid hitting his head on the oak beams. There were doilies on every surface, and the walls were covered in framed cross-stitches that said things like "Home is where the heart and the tea is." It was the antithesis of his minimalist office. It was cluttered. It was loud. It was perfect. That evening, as the owls began to hoot in the woods behind the cottage, Alistair sat on a small, lumpy sofa. He was wearing a pair of oversized wear-upon slippers Martha had insisted he put on. Poppy was sitting on the floor, leaning against his legs, finally untangling a massive knot of wool. The silence wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of his office after hours. It was a living silence, the crackle of the fire, the ticking of a grandfather clock, the soft breathing of the girl he loved. "I lost it all today, didn't I?" he said softly, staring into the flames. "The prestige, the power, the King of Canary Wharf title." Poppy stopped her knitting and looked up at him. She reached up and tugged gently on his elobe. "You didn't lose anything, you silly man. You just put down a very heavy suitcase you've been carrying for too long. Your hands were too full to hold anything else, like me or a scone." Alistair leaned down and kissed the top of her head. She smelled like sunshine and the country air. He realized she was right. For years, he'd been obsessed with possession, owning the market, owning the city, owning his legacy. He'd even tried to own Poppy, in his own clumsy, arrogant way. But love wasn't about ownership. It wasn't a hostile takeover. It was a surrender. "I think I like being a commoner," he whispered. "Good," Poppy giggled, her eyes dancing. "Because tomorrow, Aunt Martha expects you to help her weed the parsnips, and she's very strict about her root vegetables." Alistair smiled a real, unburdened smile. He thought of Seraphina in her cold glass tower, surrounded by lawyers and rage. He thought of the board members scrambling to fill his shoes. And then he looked at his feet, encased in neon pink wear-upon slippers, and felt like the luckiest man in England. "The parsnips won't know what hit them," he promised. The boundary had been crossed, the walls had crumbled, and in the ruins of his old life, something small and green and hopeful was beginning to grow. Just like Brian the cactus, it was a bit prickly, but it was alive, and for the first time in his life, Alistair wasn't looking at the horizon. He was right where he needed to be. The sun did not rise over Little Wallop so much as it politely announced its arrival with a soft, buttery glow that seeped through the chintz curtains of Aunt Martha's guest bedroom. Alistair woke up not to the aggressive, digital shriek of a smartphone, but to the rhythmic thwok-thwok-thwok of a wood pigeon somewhere in the eaves and the distinct, slightly unnerving sensation of being watched. He opened one eye. A very large, very ginger cat with a face like a squashed loaf of bread was sitting on his chest. It stared at him with unblinking emerald eyes, its tail twitching with a slow, judicial precision. "Good morning," Alistair croaked, his voice thick with sleep. "I assume you're the cat who was informed of my arrival." The cat let out a low, vibrating hum that might have been a purr or a threat, then hopped off the bed with a heavy thud, trotting toward the door as if to say, "Keep up, city boy." Breakfast waits for no one. Alistair sat up, his back protesting against the mattress which, while comfortable, lacked the orthopedic rigour of his £5,000 custom bed in Chelsea. He looked at his hands. They were clean. For now, he looked at the neon pink wear-upon slippers resting by the rug. With a sigh that was half resignation and half amusement, he slid his feet into them. Downstairs, the cottage was a riot of domesticity. The smell of frying bacon and toasted sourdough was so thick it felt like a physical embrace. Poppy was already at the table, wearing a pair of dungarees that were 3 sizes too big for her and a bright yellow headband with felt bees bouncing on springs. She was currently engaged in a high-stakes negotiation with Aunt Martha over the correct ratio of marmalade to toast. "It has to be a structural layer, Auntie," Poppy insisted, waving a butter knife. "If you can still see the bread, it's just a suggestion of marmalade. I want a commitment." "You'll have a sugar crash before the postman arrives, you silly thing," Martha chuckled, turning from the ogre with a plate of eggs that looked like perfect little sons. She looked at Alistair as he shuffled into the kitchen. "Ah, the king of the high-rises has descended. Did Barnaby let you sleep, or did he spend the night plotting your demise?" "He was very civilized. Thank you," Alistair said, taking a seat, "though I think he's disappointed I don't taste more like ham." Poppy beamed at him, her eyes crinkling in that way that always made his chest feel strangely tight. "Sleep well, Alistair. No nightmares about hedge funds or hostile takeovers." "Only one," he admitted, reaching for the teapot. "I dreamed I forgot how to tie a tie. Then I realized I wasn't wearing one, and the relief was so profound I almost woke myself up." "That's the spirit," Poppy chirped. "Now, eat up. We have a very busy day of doing absolutely nothing of any economic value. First, the parsnips, then we're going to the village shop because Mr. Henderson says the new shipment of wool has arrived, and I need a specific shade of anxious lavender for my next project." "Anxious lavender?" Alistair asked. "It's a very pale purple with just a hint of grey," she explained solemnly, "like a cloud that's worried it might rain, but isn't sure if it's been cleared for it." Alistair nodded as if this made perfect sense. In this house, it did. After breakfast, Alistair found himself standing in the garden, staring at a patch of earth that Aunt Martha had designated as the Parsnip Fortress. It was a rectangular plot of dark, rich soil, currently inhabited by a variety of green shoots that Alistair couldn't distinguish from common weeds. Right then, Martha said, handing him a trowel that looked older than the Great Fire of London. "The trick is to get the taproot out without snapping it. If you snap it, the parsnip gets grumpy and tastes like wood, and we don't like grumpy vegetables in this garden." Alistair looked down at his trousers, a pair of old cords Martha had unearthed from a trunk in the attic. They were slightly short in the leg and smelled faintly of lavender and old books. He knelt in the mud, the dampness seeping through the fabric immediately. A week ago, this would have resulted in a frantic call to his dry cleaner and a general sense of existential dread. Now, he just dug the trowel into the earth. "I feel I should tell you, Martha," Alistair said as he carefully loosened the soil around a leafy clump, "that my previous experience with gardening is limited to choosing the right species of fern for the lobby of my office building. I believe I chose plastic ones because they didn't require emotional labor." Martha laughed, a deep, raspy sound that echoed off the stone walls of the cottage. "Plants are just like people, Alistair. Most of them just want a bit of space, a drink of water, and to be left alone to do their own thing. It's when you start trying to force them to grow in directions they don't want to go that the trouble starts." He pulled. A long, slightly crooked, dirt-covered parsnip emerged from the ground. It was ugly, it was misshapen, it was the most satisfying thing he had ever produced. "I did it," he whispered, holding it up like a trophy. "Don't get cocky," Poppy shouted from the porch, where she was busy trying to untangle a string of fairy lights for no apparent reason. "That's just one. There's a whole legion of them down there, waiting to test your resolve." The morning passed in a blur of earthy smells and physical exertion. Alistair's back ached, his fingernails were ruined, and at one point, a very bold robin had landed on his shoulder and chirped loudly in his ear, presumably demanding a percentage of any worms unearthed. By noon, he was exhausted, filthy, and more relaxed than he had been in a decade. They had lunch on the porch, thick ham sandwiches and mugs of tea so strong you could probably use them to strip paint. The air was still, the only sound the distant hum of a tractor and the rustle of the wind in the rose bushes. So Poppy said, swinging her legs, "Is this it, the great retirement, or are you secretly planning a coup of the Little Wallop Parish Council? I've heard they have a very lucrative monopoly on the summer fete raffle." Alistair looked out over the rolling hills of the Hampshire countryside. He thought about the boardroom in London. He thought about the silent, glass-walled office where he'd spent 15 hours a day, surrounded by people who feared him and a woman who wanted to consume him. He thought about the cold, sharp edges of his old life. "I think the parish council is safe for now," he said, "though I might have some notes on their logistics. I noticed the village shop's inventory management is, well, it's charmingly archaic." "Don't you dare," Poppy warned, poking him with a toe. "If you start trying to optimize Mr. Henderson's Tindpea rotation, he'll ban you, and then where will you get your ginger nuts?" "God forbid," Alistair smiled. He leaned back against the porch railing. "It's strange, Poppy. For years, I thought that if I stopped moving, I'd just vanish, like a shark that has to keep swimming to breathe. I thought that power was the only thing that kept me solid. But out here, nobody cares who I am, to the robin. I'm just a tall source of worms. To Martha, I'm a novice parsnip puller, and to you." He trailed off, looking at her. Poppy had a smear of jam on her cheek and a bit of moss in her hair. She looked entirely, wonderfully unpolished. "And to me," she said softly, her playful tone shifting into something more vulnerable. "You're just Alistair, the man who was so busy looking at the stars he didn't realize he was standing in a puddle. The man who tried to buy the moon because he thought it would make him feel less lonely." She reached out and took his hand. Her palm was warm, her grip firm despite her small stature. "You don't have to be the king anymore, Alistair. You can just be a person. It's much harder. Honestly, there's no manual, and the benefits package is rubbish. But the company is better." "The company is infinitely better," he agreed. The afternoon brought a visitor. A sleek, black car entirely out of place in the muddy lane pulled up to the gate. Alistair felt a momentary flicker of the old tension. He stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers, the King of Canary Wharf reflexively straightening his spine. A man in a sharp grey suit stepped out. It was Julian, his former second-in-command. Julian looked around the cottage garden with a mixture of horror and confusion, as if he had accidentally stepped into a prehistoric exhibit. "Alistair," Julian said, stopping at the gate. I had to track you down. The firm. It's a mess. Seraphina is trying to liquidate the holding company. The board is in a total panic. And the press is having a field day. They're calling it the Great Abdication." Alistair looked at Julian. He saw the dark circles under the younger man's eyes, the way he kept checking his watch, the nervous twitch in his jaw. He saw his own reflection in Julian, and he didn't like it. "And?" Alistair asked calmly. Julian blinked. "And, Alistair, we need you back. Just for a few months. Steady the ship. Negotiate the exit. We can get you a massive severance package. 10 times what's in your contract. You can buy 10 of these cottages. You can buy the whole village." Poppy had gone quiet, watching from the porch. Martha had appeared in the doorway, a rolling pin in her hand, looking like she was ready to defend her borders against the forces of capitalism. Alistair looked at the black car. He looked at the parsnip fortress. He looked at the neon pink slippers on his feet. "Julian," Alistair said, his voice quiet but steady, "do you see that robin over there?" Julian looked at the bird, bewildered. The bird, what about it? It's waiting for me to dig up more worms, Alistair said. It has a very clear set of expectations. And I find its company much more rewarding than yours. Tell Seraphina she can have the company. Tell the board to find someone else to steady the ship. I'm currently occupied with a very important horticultural project. You're joking, Julian stammered. You're staying here, in the mud. For what? For this? He gestured vaguely at the cottage and Poppy. No, Alistair said, a small smile playing on his lips. Not for this. For me and for her. Mostly for her. Julian stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. You've lost your mind, Alistair, completely and utterly lost it. Perhaps, Alistair replied, but for the first time in my life, I know exactly where I put it. Goodbye, Julian. Try to take the corners slowly on the way out. The lane is a bit narrow for that car. As the black car retreated, the silence of the countryside rushed back in to fill the void. The tension in Alistair's shoulders dissolved, replaced by a profound sense of lightness. He felt as though he had just stepped out of a heavy suit of armor and into the cool, fresh air. Well, Martha said, tapping the rolling pin against her palm. That was dramatic. I was half hoping he'd try to come in. I've been looking for an excuse to test the structural integrity of that suit with a bit of flour. Poppy hopped down from the porch and ran to Alistair, throwing her arms around his waist. You did it. You survived the siren song of the corporate world. I was worried for a second you'd hear the word severance and start growing a tie out of your neck. Alistair laughed, lifting her up and spinning her round. Not a chance. I've grown quite fond of these slippers. And I have it on good authority that I'm needed for a very important mission involving anxious lavender wool. That's right, Poppy said, her eyes shining. And after that, we have to teach you how to make a proper pot of tea. Martha says your current technique is willfully negligent. The rest of the week passed in a beautiful, chaotic blur. Alistair learned that country life was far more exhausting than city life, but in a way that made him sleep through the night without a single thought of stock prices. He learned how to identify a weed from a seedling mostly by whether Martha shouted at him when he pulled it up. He learned that the village pub, the Fat Goose, served a pint of bitter that could cure any ailment, and that the locals didn't care about his net worth. But they were very interested in his opinion on the local cricket team's chances. He and Poppy spent their evenings walking through the meadows as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. They talked about everything and nothing. They argued about whether Brian the cactus was a he or a she. They settled on they to be safe. They planned a future that didn't involve quarterly reports or 5-year projections. One evening, as they sat on a stone wall overlooking the valley, Poppy turned to him. The playful, chaotic mask was gone, replaced by a quiet, deep sincerity. Are you really okay, Alistair? She asked. I mean, really? You went from owning the world to weeding parsnips with my aunt. It's a big jump. Alistair took a breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs. I didn't own the world, Poppy. I was just renting a very expensive seat at the table, and the rent was my soul. I'm not just okay. I'm awake for the first time. I feel like I'm actually living my life, rather than just managing it. He looked at her, the girl who had crashed into his world with her jelly babies, and her mismatched socks, and her refusal to be intimidated by his power. You saved me, he said simply. I was a machine, and you threw a handful of glitter into my gears. Everything ground to a halt, and I realized I hated the noise it was making. Poppy leaned her head on his shoulder. I didn't do much. I just showed you that the door wasn't locked. You're the one who walked through it. With a lot of pushing, he reminded her. Well, I am delightfully chaotic, she giggled. It's part of the service. Alistair reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, slightly battered object. It wasn't a diamond ring. It wasn't a piece of expensive jewellery from a Bond Street boutique. It was a small, hand-carved wooden bird he'd found in the village shop, a robin, roughly painted but full of character. "I know it's not much," he said, handing it to her. "But it's the first thing I've bought in 10 years that wasn't an investment. I just liked it, because it reminded me of the one in the garden, and because it's small and a bit wonky. And I think it belongs with us." Poppy took the little bird, her fingers tracing the carved wings. She didn't say anything for a moment, and for a terrifying second, Alistair thought he'd been too sentimental, too common. Then she looked up, and her eyes were wet. "It's perfect," she whispered. "It's the least efficient gift anyone has ever given me. I love it." She tucked the bird into her dungaree pocket, and then, with a sudden burst of her usual energy, she jumped off the wall. "Right then, race you back to the cottage. Last one there has to help Martha pluck the chickens tomorrow." "Wait, plucking chickens," Alistair shouted, scrambling off the wall. "You never mention chickens." "It's a surprise," she called back, her laughter ringing out across the quiet valley. Life is full of surprises. Alistair tried to keep up. Alistair ran. He ran through the long grass, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding not with the stress of a deadline, but with the sheer, unadulterated joy of the chase. He watched the girl in the bee headband disappear into the twilight, a bright, chaotic spark in the fading light. He wasn't a king anymore. He wasn't a mogul. He wasn't a titan of industry. He was Alistair. He was wearing pink slippers and carrying a wooden robin. He was muddy, he was tired, and he was deeply, hopelessly in love. The boundary of possession had been crossed, and on the other side, he hadn't found loss, he had found himself. As he reached the gate of the cottage, the lights in the windows glowing like warm embers, he stopped for a moment and looked up at the stars. They were the same stars that shone over London, over the glass towers and the cold boardrooms, but here they didn't look like distant goals to be conquered, they just looked like lights. Alistair smiled, wiped a bit of mud off his cheek, and walked inside. The parsnips, after all, were waiting, and so was Poppy, and in the grand scheme of things, nothing else really mattered.